Matt.
Sweet. All right. That's excellent. So thanks very much for having me. I think these interactions with South African breeders have always been good, and I'm more than happy to be here this time around. So I think Mike proposed an interesting topic for this discussion around the differences that we observe in Bos indicus cattle compared to some others, particularly around specifics of their genetic reproductive performance. I've taken just a few liberties with that title, and I'll kind of talk to opportunities that we've got, specifically in the Brahman breed, to improve reproduction by selection, and certainly touch on why that's so important. So just the areas I'd like to cover this morning for you guys is specifically to address why there's such unique opportunities in Brahmans to improve, productivity and profitability by selecting to improve reproduction. We'll look specifically at that from the profitability angle, and then look at the biological challenges that are a little bit unique to the Brahman breed. After that, we'll do a bit of a look at some of the historical research that's been done in this area. And that's mostly research that was done as part of the beef CRC here in Australia. And then bring you right up to date with new researches going on in two projects, the Repronomics, which is very northern focused, and specifically dealing with Brahmans and other tropical breeds. And a new project called the Southern Multi-Breed Project, which also involves Brahmans, but is more southern production focused. And then we'll look at how all of this research is being applied in the genetic evaluation for the Brahman breed.
Eileen, how you doing?
It's not just the research that's going on, it's how we're applying it for genetic evaluation. And I think, just to bring us all onto a level playing field, I had a really quick search on what's happening in this area in South Africa. And it was somewhat reassuring to find that researchers in your part of the world are finding very, very similar results to those we're observing in Australia. This is just a quick quote from some leading researchers in South Africa who identified that reproduction rate is really key to profitability for Southern African breeders, and that this number of 62% calving or weaning rate is one worth keeping in mind. I think we'll see something that looks very similar to that as we look at the results we got in Australia. So just to start off, I think just a really quick look at profitability and its association with reproduction in the Brahman breed. And while we hear a lot about this anecdotally, I think we've got an opportunity via the breed object system, which is the software package that we use in Australia to develop selection indexes, to look, to put some hard numbers against the real importance of reproduction to profitability in Brahman breeding enterprises. And this system looks very specifically at your production system. So it's an economic analysis of the inputs and outputs in your entire production system. And that includes the market you're supplying and the returns you're getting for the animals you're turning off. The information it analyzes is based on a survey, a questionnaire. You provide a lot of detail about your situation, the costs in your system, the returns in that system. And with that information, and based entirely on economics, it derives weightings for traits in a selection index and ranks them according to how significantly they're driving profitability. And what we get out of that is a graph like this one, which is for the Brahman Jap Ox index here in Australia, but it's representative of output for all indexes, and a relative weighting of the importance of each of these traits to profitability. And what we're seeing here is a list of traits in the breeding objectives. So things like the weight of animals at sale, dressing percentage, saleable meat yield, how fat animals are, cow weaning rate, marbling, cow survival, cow weight itself, and some calving ease traits. The important thing to recognise here is that we don't actually have EBVs for any of these. These are the actual traits that drive profitability. And it stands out very much that for the Brahman breed, cow weaning rate or reproduction rate is far and away the most important driver of profitability, for this production system and frankly for any Brahman production system, almost as important as everything else put together. The next step in this process is to translate that information into the breeding values and the traits we're actually recording for breed plans. So we have, milk, 200-day weight, 400-day weight, 600-day weight, days to calving, which is our description of female reproduction in the evaluation, scrotal size, fatness, eye muscle area, all of the EBVs we should be familiar with. And this 47% translates to a 40% weighting on days to calving. So again, extremely, by far the most important factor driving profitability for Brahman breeders. And really importantly, this is based on economics. It's not opinion. So there's never a stage in this process when we or some faceless men sit around a table and say, I reckon days to calving needs a 40% weighting. It's all based on really hard economic information. So with that as a bit of background, I think it's pretty clear why we're so focused on reproduction, in all tropical breeds and particularly in Brahmans. That's the case in Australia, and I certainly think it's very likely to be true for any Brahman producers who manage breeding females in these, harsh, tropical, arid, semi-arid environments that I think we in Australia and you in Southern Africa are very familiar with. And I think a key defining feature of these environments is that at some stage through that annual cycle, you're in a period of energy deficit. The demands of females for energy are greater than they can get from the environment they're in. And I think if you're in that situation, everything we talk about is going to be relative. And growth and carcass traits, while important, are a really distant second to reproduction. So with that setting the scene a bit, we can go on to look at research that's been aimed at better understanding the genetics of reproduction traits for the Brahman breed. And in Australia, a lot of work has been done in that area as part of beef CRC research, which was a 21-year-long, essentially, progeny test, which wrapped up in 2014. But I think the results are still very relevant to what we're doing today and certainly informing the research direction that we are taking right now. The CRC was a big research effort. It was a cross-disciplinary collaborative project. Importantly, every time we applied for CRC funding, we had to come armed with matching support from industry. So that kept us extremely industry relevant. We were focused on issues that were relevant to industry. It was broken up into 3 stages over that 21-year period, but we will be focusing on the later 2 of those, which focus on traits relating to female reproduction, be it heifer puberty, cow rebreeding, cow lifetime reproductive outcomes, as well as a quick note on male reproduction. So the experiment itself looked at around 1,000 Brahman females and a little more than that in a group we called tropical composites, which I'll describe in just a sec. This is not huge numbers. There have certainly been bigger experiments, but it's really the level of detail that we went to with this that gives us such confidence in the results that we obtained from it. So these 1,000-odd animals for Brahmans and composites were progeny of 50 sires of each breed. we recorded female and male reproduction intensively, and how we did that we'll cover in a sec. And it's another talk entirely, but their half-sib brothers were followed through feedlot finishing to slaughter to get carcass and meat quality traits on them as well. So this group of composites is a pretty broad category. The definition was animals that were 50% tropically adapted and 50% non-adapted, but that adaptation could come from Bos indicus or non-indicus breeds. So we had everything from straight up Brahman F1 crossbreds to a composite breed that contained both Brahman and Taurus adapted genetics, to Belmont Reds, which are essentially an analogue for Bonsmaras, bred here in Australia, but which have only adaptation from Taurus genes. And just to get our bearings, this is a map of Northern Australia. This is Queensland here. These green dots are the locations of our female research stations, so where the actual recording happened in central Queensland, and a few properties that were more coastal. The red dots are where we source the composites from. The yellow dots are the original herds of origin for the Brahmins. This red dotted line is the Tropic of Capricorn, which goes through Rockhampton in Australia, and in South Africa lines up about with Petersburg. So a lot of this country was like that far northern South African, fairly arid sort of country. On the female side, heifers were first mated as 2-year-olds, which is very much standard practice for that part of the world. We did impose a 3-month mating period on them, so a lot of commercial herds joined for longer than that, but we wanted to really push them reproductively so they express these genetic differences, and we certainly caused that to happen. Apart from that, they're managed under very commercial conditions, but importantly, they stayed in the herd only, we only removed them from the herd if they failed to reproduce successfully in 2 consecutive years. So we hung on to them for as long as we could, but if they didn't get calved over 2 years, they had to go. So I think the first really important result to come out of all this is around this trait that's in the breeding objective, and that's lifetime weaning rate or lifetime reproductive rate. So you can see for Brahmins and our tropical composites, the number of animals, but really importantly, the average lifetime weaning rate that we saw from these females. And for Brahmins, that number looks very similar at 62% of what was reported for South African breeders.
Matt, if I can come in for a second, if you can just zoom down your screen, maybe. It's not fitting the screen completely.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So
let me. Is that any better?
No, it's not, Matt.
Michael, on my side, I can see the screen.
You can see it properly. Okay, then it might be our side, Matt. Just keep going.
I think Zita can just confirm on my side. I can see the full screen. Wayne, can you see the full screen?
Yes, I can see the screen.
Oh, good. All right. Oh, okay. Sorry, Mike.
Yes. No, it's our side, Matt. I fixed that.
Yeah. All right. All right. Oh, good.
You might get some questions on mating those 2-year-olds, Matt, but you can continue. Willem might be the first to ask you a question about why would you want to mate a Brahmin at 2 years old? But you can carry on.
you got to get something out of them eventually. But happy to talk about it. So, as I was saying, around 62% reproductive rates. And while this trait, has a lot of noise in it, any trait like lifetime weaning rate, days to calving, has a lot of noise. It is therefore not especially heritable, about 10% heritability in Brahmins, even a little less than that in the composites. But the really key thing is that there is vast range in a lot of genetic variation. So EBVs for this trait cover a range from minus 11% to plus 16% for Brahmins, which is a range of due to genetic differences in their size of 20%, 27%, sorry, in reproductive rate, which is a vast difference, and gave us a lot of motivation to carry on and try to describe these reproduction traits a little bit more accurately, which is what we tackled in that second phase of the beef CRC. It was a lot of work, but we kind of set out to identify the underlying causes for these low reproduction rates and look at whether we could change these by selection. The way we did that, after a lot of kind of thinking and research and trying to find the best way, was via ultrasound scanning, looking specifically at the function of the ovaries of these females. We don't have a lot of pictures of these images, but this is an image of the ovary that we look at to get these measurements. This is an example in a pre-pubertal heifer. So this is the ovary. Each of these dark spots is a follicle, so a pre-egg shedding state and interpreted as pre-pubertal, where this picture on the right is of a large corpus luteum, which identifies that the animal is cycling. And the first time we see that, we use to identify the date and therefore the age at puberty. And that meant a lot of scanning. You can't just do this once. We were doing it in kind of 4 to 6 week intervals, continuously on these females from essentially weaning and to and beyond their first mating, which meant some heifers got 15 measurements before we spotted a CL. The other really important trait in all this is lactation and estrus interval, and that's the time for wet females to start recycling again after they've calved. So exactly the same scanning process. We start at mating. So in wet first calf females, once the bull goes in, we start scanning and do the same process as we do for age at puberty to identify when those wet females start cycling again. And by the end of the beef CRC, we had 60 records on a lot of these females and, well over 300,000 records to analyse. So I think the really key result out of all of this is that we'll start with age at puberty, but certainly for a reproduction trait where we're used to things like days to calving, weaning rate having a heritability of 10% if we're lucky. This age of puberty trait had a heritability of 0.6 for Brahmans. 60% of the variation we observe in the paddock, we can say is due to who your parents were. And that was a real turning point for our understanding of the trait and for what we could do to drive genetic progress for it. And this is just an example of that raw data. So this is just a plot of ages at puberty, from 400 days all the way up to almost 1,200 days old, and just the number of animals that appeared in each of these bins. And it's a normal-ish distribution for the sinus among us. For animals that are getting mated at 2 years old, though, it means that only half of them are pubertal by the time that mating happens. And if we have a 3-month mating period, it really importantly means that there is this whole group out here, which is 13% of those animals who did not cycle prior to the end of that first mating period, which means they had no chance of getting pregnant. And that's a large chunk of those animals that are responsible for the 62% reproductive rate. Of those that did cycle, so everything that appears to the right of the end of that, to the left of the end of that mating period, 90% conceived, only 72% of them weaned a calf, and the difference between that number and that number is a subject for a whole other discussion, but that gives us our overall 62% weaning rate. What this means, all of this variation and the high heritability for this trait means there is huge opportunity to identify genetically superior animals and to make genetic progress for this trait. Now, while age of puberty is important, I think the more important of these two traits is lactation and estrus. You know, puberty only really hits at their first mating. Lactation and estrus hits every time you rebreed a wet female. And pleasingly, this trait was also highly heritable. 50% for Brahmins, dropped a little bit for the tropical composites. But again, also vast amount of genetic variation, which means we've got masses of opportunity to make genetic progress for this trait. And this table is just a list of the lactation and estrus interval EBVs for Brahman size of those females. So this is the best 10 and the worst 10 of those size. And we can see that the range, even if we say this Belmont bull at the bottom was a bit of an outlier, which he certainly was, we've got a range from the top to the bottom of that of at least 200 days. And if you think about it, assuming that this is 50% heritable, half of the EBV is going to be passed on to their daughters. It means the progeny of those best size will have at least a lactation and estrus period 3 months shorter than the worst. And when you have got a 3-month mating window, it means that the progeny of size at this end of the distribution have got no chance of rebreeding. And we certainly observed that. You know, there were some size whose female progeny simply would not cycle until those calves were weaned. And being able to identify that is a really key result from all this work. Very quickly, how are we going for time? We're okay. While we were doing all this stuff for female reproduction, we were also really...
Matt, you think we should throw in some questions quickly on those other 3 slides?
Absolutely. Happy to take them.
Well, you want to do it later, because you're going to have quite a lot of discussion, I think, Matt. The first one is because there's a lot of discussion about what the correct age is to mate a Brahman heifer for the first time.
Yep.
And you showed there, you mate them as 2-year-olds. A lot of our producers will tell you if you mate them as 2-year-olds, you stunt their growth to some extent, and they never become decent females.
Yep.
Your first opinion about what age you should mate.
Look, I really think it's dictated by your environment as much as the genetics that you're running in that environment. You know, if you are in a genuinely, an environment that is harsh enough that, this graph, and this is really the key trait that we're talking about, this, when do they reach puberty in this discussion? And if you find your animals are not pubertal when you're mating them as 2-year-olds, then you don't have much choice but to wait until they are. There is a small contingent in Australia who are kind of having a similar discussion around mating as yearlings, this whole graph can shift depending on the environment you're running these animals in. So for some people, this peak will fall when they're much younger. For some people, this peak will fall when they're older. And that is a function of the environment you're running in as well as genetics. So you've got to manage to your environment to some extent. But I think the really interesting thing about this graph is that it shows there is massive variation, in what was a pretty average combination of environments for Australia. So whatever environment you're running in, you're going to have animals that are capable of breeding and doing so successfully, and then rebreeding. Those genetics will certainly be there. And I think if you go to the effort to identify them, you give yourself a massive, a really powerful tool to make genetic progress. as far as managing your country, I think I can only say that, you know, you guys know that far better than I do, but I think you have to manage according to the environment. But I think this information tells us that there will be genetics which can perform better in an average environment than other genetics. And if we identify them, we can change that.
Matt, that's really good information. Would you select by age or do you select by weight?
Neither. I think, well, certainly the trait we defined around this puberty issue was an age-based one. So it was at what age do you become pubertal, and we have produced breeding values for that. And I think as a selection trait, yeah, as a basis for selection, age is far better than weight. There are a lot of reasons why making your selection criteria an age-based trait rather than a weight-based trait at puberty is superior. If you do it based on weight, you're bringing a lot of correlated traits along with it, but doing it for age, it's specifically addressing the physiology of puberty.
Matt, then I want us to carry on, but how do you practically measure if an animal is pubertal at 2-year-olds? Do you got to do it by scanning? Is it practical?
I don't think so. I don't think in the commercial world, these are traits that we can expect people to be measuring. But I do think in the era of genomics and single-step analysis, which Breed Plan is running quite successfully for Brahmans here in Australia, there's real opportunity to intensively record these traits in a well-constructed reference population, and that's one that is representative of the broader population, and use genomic relationships to allow that intensive recording and the accuracy it generates to be spread around the population. And I think we're certainly seeing these and some other traits now as ones that aren't recorded even by seed stock producers, but are recorded in research and breed level funded reference populations on behalf of the breed, and that information is then, via genomics spread around to all related animals in the breed. And I think it's a really exciting prospect that this is becoming possible.
Hey, Matt, I'm going to allow you to carry on. I'll ask Robin's question later on.
That's fine. I might just skip a little bit quickly through the bull stuff. The main point here is that while we were spending all this time working on the female side of things, we weren't ignoring the male side. All of the male progeny of those females that we did all the age of puberty and lactation and estrus recording in were evaluated for a sperm morphology trait. And that was done at 3 ages, at 12, 18 and 24 months of age. And the resulting trait that we get is % normal sperm. And it's just the proportion of normal sperm cells in that sample. It's heritable, although its heritability is very age dependent. So this is the age at which these samples were taken for Brahmans and the tropical composite bulls. Heritability, at 12 months of age for Brahman, we got virtually no viable samples from those young bulls, but improving to, 6 months later to be 30% heritable. Composites who matured a bit earlier, the best time to do it was at that 12-month mark. So very age dependent, got to be measured at the right time. But if you do that, it gives us a trait that not only gives us some opportunity to make genetic progress for male reproduction, but really importantly, it's related to these two traits we spent so much time recording in females. So for age of puberty and lactation and estrus, in Brahmans, we're seeing genetic correlations that tell us that if we
Weer inbring.
select on the basis of this male trait, we can make progress for the female trait as well. So I think just to summarize all that fairly quickly, you know, through a fairly sustained research effort, we now have really accurate descriptors of female reproduction, which are highly heritable, which means we can make really rapid genetic progress on the basis of recording these traits, you know, if we do that recording and if we get it into our genetic evaluations. And it's really pleasing to see that the Brahman breed on the back of this has a really noticeable improvement year in, year out for days to calving over the last 5 or 6 years on the back of you know, all of this hitting breed plan for the breed. Male traits can be exploited as indicators of both of those female traits, as well as allowing us to drive, you know, genetic progress for male reproduction as well. And as we were just discussing, Mike, there's no getting around the fact they're difficult, expensive, and really expertise intensive to record, you know, which means they're probably going to fall into the reference population sort of domain for the foreseeable future. So just this final bit is looking at, you know, all of that kind of wrapped up in 2014, and these next two projects are how we've progressed that work since then. And the first one is a northern focus project called the Repronomics Project, which is run by David Johnson, my boss here at AGBU. It's structured very similarly to that CRC experiment. We continue to measure these heifer traits intensively, measuring lactation and estrus interval intensively. And the males, we're putting the focus on their feedlot finishing performance and slaughter traits, but we will continue to get male traits from industry. The really important part of it is that we've expanded the range of breeds. So we've brought in Santa Gertrudis and Drought Masters. It's not out of the question that we could include more new breeds as time goes by. But really importantly, while it's not happening right now, the next phase of this project will include evaluating these traits in crossbreds. And I think it will start to form the basis for a crossbreed genetic evaluation in Northern Australia with EBVs which are comparable across breeds, and that can actually happen fairly soon. But you know, the ultimate goal is to have EBVs which can be generated for crossbred animals, and that's still a ways off. But I think it's a worthwhile goal, and one that the commercial industry has been crying out for quite some time. And it's not just the north where this is happening. We've just started a big new project in the south, which essentially replicates the experimental design of the CRC and the Repronomics, but includes completely different breeds. We're doing it for Herefords, Angus, Shorthorns, Charolais, Wagyus, and we've got Brahmans in the mix as well. So we're bringing down Brahman females and Brahman sires that have been used in the Repronomics and CRC projects. So we get really good linkage between these two populations. And if our ambitions in the north are to create a multi-breed genetic evaluation, this creates at least a possibility that could exist for temperate breeds as well. And I think that, again, is something the commercial industry has been crying out for. But very much a project focused on similar sorts of traits, intensively recording female reproduction in the same way. A lot of focus on mature cow traits, how cows are able to maintain themselves through that annual cycle, and looking at male growth and carcass traits as well. And really importantly, as I said, all of this isn't just research, it's being done with the aim of improving our breed plan evaluation. So age at puberty and lactation and estrus data is now entering the evaluation. While we don't have individual EBVs for those traits, they're in there as correlated with days to calving, and really expanding the range in days to calving breeding values for the Brahman breed, and significantly increasing the accuracy of those EBVs. We've also got a % normal sperm EBV published for Brahmans, and that's coming soon for other tropical breeds as well. I think I've said all that. No getting around the fact that in any of these tough environments, whatever type of animals you're running, reproduction is going to be the driving force behind profitability. These new traits give us some real opportunities to make rapid genetic progress. And I think, as we've said, while it's a discussion for another time and can be quite a long one, all of this is kind of pointing to a slightly new model for genetic evaluation, where we can record some of these really important but hard to measure traits in small representative populations and allow genomics to spread that around your breed. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Mike.
Yes, Matt, that was excellent. And if you go to the chat group, I don't know if you can see it, there are quite a lot of questions already posted there, and Sitz and I will later on give a talk on how to measure days to calving. While we've got you here, Matt, for the next 15 minutes, if we can just get some questions and answers from you, because I think we don't always get this opportunity.
That's fine. Happy to do it.
So the first question here was from Robin. Can the reproduction rate be influenced by outside forces, medical management, or is it better just to cull and manage?
Certainly, so much of the work we've done in this area has been focused on those northern environments, and really the opening comment we make about that region is that it is really difficult to change that environment. And it's certainly difficult to do it economically. And I think it's why so much focus was put on finding genetic means to tackle these questions. And I believe if depending on the extensiveness of the operation, if you look at the real cold, hard economics of it, most interventions you make are going to struggle to be economical. And I think genetics, the great thing about genetics, as we always say, is it's permanent and it's cumulative. So any genetic progress you can make will stay with you, and any genetic improvement over time you make will just continue to accumulate. And I think that is probably a more appealing way to address this issue than trying to change these very extensive environments, that are characterized by some pretty tough conditions.
Yes, Matt, if I can come in here, Matt, I think there's going to be a realization that you can improve reproduction by bull selection. It is identifying the bulls with the genetics for good reproductive daughters. The same as in the milk industry, we select bulls for good milk production. In cattle breeding, we select bulls that have the EBVs for female fertility. We select the cows as well, but the emphasis needs to be on the bull, even stronger on the bull, because 50% of your genetics is coming from the bull, and that means the whole herd you're affecting genetically through reproduction.
Most definitely, Mike. I definitely agree. And it's amazing, even in the stud industry here in Australia, how many stud breeders believe that they are generating improvement to their genetic reproduction by culling females that fail reproductively. And that's true, but the impact of that is nothing compared to the bulls you put in at the other end. The males that you select are going to be the driving force of your genetic direction and will certainly dictate the genetics of your herd into the future. So anything you do with the cow herd, can be important from a production point of view. Whether it's economic, whether it is economic or not is for you to decide in your situation. But as far as changing the genetics of the herd, it is the male side that is going to be the real driver of that.
Thanks, Matt. And I think Zitza will take you up on that and might ask you for something for their journal on that. Just from my side, define lactation and estrus. Matt, you talk a lot about lactation and estrus. Does that mean that the cow has got a calf next to it?
So it's a trait of only cows that have a calf at foot. And, the annual cycle of, the breeding for cattle means that they have to conceive while they've got that calf at foot. And lactation and estrus, as we called it, is simply how long it takes a cow with a calf at foot to start cycling again after she's had that calf. Because we didn't want to be bringing females in with very young calves at foot, we didn't start scanning until the beginning of mating. So there's a bit of a window there that we're not able to describe. But if we go from, we start scanning the day the bull goes in and scan at monthly intervals throughout that mating period. And in the case of these research projects, beyond it to catch, exactly when each female starts cycling again. So that lactation and estrus trait is in days, and it's just days from mating until we observe the first CL.
Matt, the next question is how many days after calving is it best to mate? I suspect in this case, the person doesn't have a breeding season or a bull in date and a bull out date. Asking that question. Can you just comment on that?
So how many days after, sorry, just repeat it if you would, Mike.
Yes, it's how many days after calving is best to mate.
Right. Well, on average, the raw lactation and estrus figure was close to 80 days, I think. I'd have to check that, but it's not a small number. And I think, just give me, well, certainly there is a period for almost all females when immediately following calving, they won't cycle. And there is a period of time as you go on from calving, animals start to recommence cycling. And we're finding that, most of those Brahman animals, that period can be, not a short time. So I think the exact number is going to vary dramatically from environment to environment. And I would find it hard to recommend a hard figure, particularly not understanding the environment the question's coming from. But
Matt, I guess it's almost. Come in, Willem.
I wonder. I know this is a discussion we always have around the campfires and everything on this. I think there's more for people who do artificial insemination to say, if my cow calf, after how many days must I start with the process to get this cow back into the cycle? I think, is it now 50 days? Is it now 60 days, 80 days? I like what I heard from Matt is that he say, you must look around 80 days. I think there's more the question for the people who's doing artificial insemination, not actually in the calving season, because it's not. I think the question is focused on that part. Thank you.
Sorry, understood. That does make sense. We have done an awful lot of fixed time AI in this project, and look, I would have to refresh my memory exactly what that period is in the case of this project and the projects we're running. We are just starting to get some information out about that, and I think it's really important information for industry, but I won't quite venture an opinion on that. And certainly that it will be different for many environments is true. But if you're forcing cyclicity by the drugs you're using for an AI program, you probably create opportunities that aren't there naturally. So when they start cycling naturally is different to when they will respond best to synchronization. And I would just have to get that number before I committed to it with confidence. Sorry.
Matt, the next question, basically from Willem, how will we identify the genetics for early puberty? And yes, if you could just comment on that.
Really, really pleasingly, all of these analyses said that age at puberty and lactation and estrus are both correlated with days to calving. So if you're able to make selection decisions in your evaluation on days to calving, you will be pushing both of those traits in the right direction. And I'm not sure where we're up to with a cross-country evaluation, but if that ever happens, I think there you will benefit from the recording that's happened in Australia if the relationships are there. But certainly if you select on the basis of days to calving, you will be improving both of those traits.
Yes, and that's why you did your experiment, Matt, or not your thing, taking those heifers and actually scanning them for early ovarian development and finding at 2-year-olds that 50% of them were unable to mate because of genetics, basically. But the important message to me, Matt, was that 50% of them were able to cycle, and what was it, of those 75% produced a calf.
Exactly, Mike. That's my take on it as well. I think the huge genetic variation for these traits means we can change it quite quickly. And you're right. We had animals in these groups that would not could only calve every second year. And in, standing right beside them in the same environment, same feed, same age, same everything, we had cows that cycled early, conceived a calf and weaned it every time. And they're the ones that these traits allow us to identify with the greatest accuracy, and certainly what we want to see more of in the industry.
Matt, it's 8 o'clock over here and I see the staff are coming in, but I'm sure, Willem, have you got any more questions from your side?
Michael, no, I think it was brief. It was very, very learningful. Matt, thank you from my side. I think we had a couple of practical stuff, and I also made myself a couple of notes here, and I realized there's things that we have had to look about. Actually, because this discussion on mating of heifers, it's always a discussion. When shall I start? When shall I start? Should I put them in a synchronization program at 2 years? Also, I start already at 20 months. That's a discussion. I think we've got it clear this morning. What is the direction to go? And I think, Michael, to summarize, is that that's why I asked a question about how do you identify the genetics? What do we want? Do we want efforts that's more early, ready for mating, early mature, early puberty, or are we comfortable with 2 years, 24 months? And how are we going to manage to get that in the process? And how are we as a Brahman breeders group, and might be the breed performance group, Wayne and Zitz and the team must help us and guide us and say, how are we going to do this in to identify that? And if we must give guidance to our breeders on how to work with your heifers. Must I put my efforts as might be 20 months from 20 months with the bull and see which are ready for mating? There's a type of practical things. And Michael, I would like to have a discussion with you and even with Zitza and Wayne from a breed improvement. Say, I think we must guide the breeders to manage this so that we can do the future selection on this. That's from my side. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Matt. Very interesting.
My pleasure.
Absolutely
Thanks for having
right,
me.
Willem. And we will bring Matt in again when we have that discussion. Matt works with Brahman, and if there's anybody in the world that understands Brahman female fertility, it would be Matt. Matt, thank you very much from our side for what was an exceptionally useful discussion. We've recorded it, and we'll be putting out the recording as well for our members. But thank you very much, Matt. You're always willing to give us these talks, and we appreciate it a lot.
Yep. No, outstanding. Any time. That's been great. All right. See you later.